Hi, and welcome back to Into the Word, especially to a big picture of the Old Testament. In today's session, we will take a big look at the book of Genesis, the book of beginnings. If you ever watch movies, you will notice that usually within the first few minutes, you are introduced to the main characters and the plot. Let's say that you're watching a romantic movie. Usually within the first few minutes, you see a beautiful girl and a handsome-looking guy, but perhaps they live far, far away from each other. Because it's a romantic movie, you know that they will meet and fall in love with each other. But you have to watch the movie to figure out how this will actually happen. The same is true for action movies. In an action movie, usually in the beginning, you get introduced to the good guys and the bad guys. The bad guys have either committed a crime and the good guys will try to catch them, or perhaps the bad guys are trying to commit a crime, they're trying to do something really, really bad, and the good guys will try to prevent them from doing so. The same is also true in novels. Usually in a novel, within the first chapter, you are introduced to the main character and to the plot of the book. This is also true of the Bible. In the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, we are introduced to the main characters and the plot. The main characters are God, Adam and Eve and their offspring, and Satan. And the plot is that after Adam and Eve were created, they were disobedient to God, and this created a distance between them and God. This plot is then developed throughout the rest of the Bible. Genesis is the first book of the Bible, but it's also the first book of a subsection called the Pentateuch. The word Pentateuch comes from two words which mean 5 and scroll. The Pentateuch is also referred to as the Law or the books of Moses. Jewish people refer to the Pentateuch as the Torah. The word Torah actually means law, but it can also be translated as instruction or teaching. Now, when we talk about the law, it doesn't mean that every single thing in those 5 books is about the law. As a matter of fact, in the book of Genesis, we find very little law. Most of the book of Genesis is really historical, and it includes some poetry. But we have to picture the Pentateuch as 5 different books written on 5 different scrolls, and each of these books has a distinct emphasis. Jesus actually referred to the books of the law, or to the Pentateuch, in Luke chapter 16 and verse 16, when he mentioned the law and the prophets. The Pentateuch begins with the creation of the world and ends with the Israelites ready to enter the promised land. The book of Genesis can really be divided into 2 parts. First, there is Genesis chapters 1 through 11, and there is Genesis chapters 12 through 50. Every story has to have a beginning, and the Bible opens with the words, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." This is a Hebrew expression that means that God created everything. The first chapter of Genesis tells us that God created the universe. He created the world and everything on the world. When he was done creating the world, he created Adam and Eve. The difference between the rest of creation and Adam and Eve was that Adam and Eve were created in God's image, and they had the ability to have a relationship with God. We see this relationship as God visited Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and he talked with them. God gave Adam and Eve one rule, and the rule was that they were not allowed to eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You're probably familiar with the story, and you know that Satan came in the form of a serpent and tempted Eve to eat from the fruit. Both Adam and Eve gave in to this temptation. As a result, they were told by God that they had to leave the garden, and this created a distance between them and God. At the same time, God gave a message of hope. He told Satan, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." That's in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. Chapter 4 then shows us how sin really became really bad on earth. So just think of it. Adam and Eve disobeyed God by disobeying just the one rule he gave them. But Adam and Eve, after they left the garden, they had 2 sons, and one son killed the other. So this shows us how sin became really bad very, very quickly. Chapter 5 then gives us the genealogy from Adam to Noah. Now Moses could just have written, "A long time after this happened, Noah was born." But for Jewish people, a genealogy was extremely important. If Moses had just written a long time after this, Noah was born, people would have asked, well, who was Noah and where did he come from? How is he related to this story? So chapter 5 gives us a long genealogy so that Jewish people may understand the connection from Adam to Noah. By the time Noah was born, sin was so rampant on the earth, and so we're now in Genesis chapter 6 through 9. There was so much sin on the earth that God decided to destroy the earth with a flood. But in his mercy, by his grace, he decided to save Noah and his family. Unfortunately, as you know, this did not solve the sin problem. Genesis chapters 10 and 11 then show who the descendants of Noah were and how people spread across the earth after the flood according to their different languages. So Genesis chapters 1 through 11 is a really good introduction to the rest of the Bible. It shows us the beginning of the universe, it shows us the beginning of the world, and it shows us the beginning of humanity. And even though Adam and Eve sinned and were put out of the garden, there was a promise made that God would bring a solution to the sin problem. Chapter 11 then ends by showing us how different people on earth spread across the world according to their different languages. That brings us to the second section, which is chapters 12 through 50. At the end of chapter 11, we are introduced to a man by the name of Abram. Chapter 12 opens up with God telling Abram to leave his country, his family, the place where he lived, his father's household, and to go to another land. Abraham and his family lived at that time in Haran. The map shows you where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers are located. You also see an approximate location of Haran in Mesopotamia. When Abraham and his family left Haran, they would have followed the rivers so that they had access to water for themselves and their animals. We don't exactly know which route they took, but I estimate that in moving from Haran to Canaan, they covered about 300 miles or 500 kilometers. To give you an idea of the distance, if you're perhaps from southern Africa, that would be from traveling from Johannesburg to Durban, which is close by the Indian Ocean. In Asia, it would be like crossing South Korea from the northeastern border all the way to the southwest. In Europe, it would be like traveling from Milan, Italy to Rome. And in the United States, it would be like traveling from Los Angeles to San Jose, California. And of course, when Abraham and his family traveled, they traveled by camel. When Abraham arrived in Canaan, God said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So with this story of God's interaction with Abram, we see the beginning of the Jewish people, the Jewish faith, and therefore also the Christian faith. When Abram arrived in Canaan, God made two promises to Abram. The first one is found in Genesis 12, verse 2. God promised to Abram that he would have many descendants. These descendants would later be called the Jewish people or the Israelites. Of course, these people also needed a place to live, so the second promise was a promise for land. That's in Genesis 12, verse 7. The story of Abram, who was later called Abraham, is not so much different from our story as we try to live a life of faith and obedience to God. When God told Abram to leave his family and his country, he didn't really know where he was going, and he didn't know how it would all work out. But he stepped out in faith and obedience, and he decided to trust God. Sometimes God wants us to leave the familiar for the unfamiliar. God wants us to respond in faith and obedience. Sometimes there are detours in life. Sometimes things don't really work out the way we thought they would work out. There may be ups and downs, there may be successes and failures, there may be some detours. But in the long run, everything works out just the way God wants it to work out. We can look back on the life we have already lived, and we can realize that God was with us. But we don't have any idea of what lays ahead of us in the future. And this is where God sometimes wants us to step out in faith and in obedience. And I believe that the life of Abraham should be an encouragement to us, because we can see that God is faithful, and that he will stand by his word, and that he will do what he says he will do. Abraham stepped out in faith, and he became a blessing, not just to the Jewish people, but to the entire world, because Jesus is a descendant of Abraham. Abraham had a son named Isaac, and Isaac had a son named Jacob. In Genesis chapter 32, verse 28, we see that Jacob's name was changed to Israel. From then on, the descendants of Jacob were known as the Jewish people, but also as the Israelites. Jacob had 11 sons, and in his old age he had one more son whom he called Joseph. The first 11 sons didn't really like Joseph very much, and when he was a young man, they sold him into slavery to the Egyptians. In Egypt, through a set of circumstances, Joseph became the second in command. After that happened, there was a great famine in Canaan, and the first 11 sons went down to Egypt to buy food. That's where they reconnected with Joseph. To make a long story short, all of the 11 brothers and their father, so all of Jacob and his sons and their family ended up living in Egypt. So this is where the book of Genesis actually ends. It is with the Israelites living in Egypt. To summarize, the book of Genesis is the book of beginnings. The beginning of the universe, the beginning of earth, the beginning of everything on earth, the beginning of humanity, the beginning of the Jewish faith, and therefore also the beginning of the Christian faith. In the next session, we will continue with Exodus and Leviticus. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.